It's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to Rise of Cromwell, Marston, Moor, 1644, English Civil War by Kings and Generals. Now, if you haven't seen my reactions to the other episodes in the series, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. So, with that being said, the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, it is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input, or ask any curious questions which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. With that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals, another amazing history channel here on YouTube. So without further ado, let's get this up on screen, and here we go.
In 1603, King James I became the inheritor of both the crowns of England and Scotland, bonding the two historically rival kingdoms in a royal union. However, it was clear that unresolved divisions still existed between the unruly neighbours, which would serve as a barrier to peace. Political and religious tension between Charles I's court in London and the Presbyterians of Scotland was one of the primary factors
which seems to be cause of a lot of wars during these times, and greed.
It led to war breaking out in 1642. In 1644, this fact would shift the nature of the ongoing conflict completely.
Yep.
Welcome to our fourth video on the 17th century English civil wars, covering the continued duel between Parliament and Royalists, the Scottish Covenanter intervention, and the climactic battle at Marston Moor. With war and conspiracy plaguing the land, the big players had to worry that their communication .com.
Feel free to check that out if you're interested.
By the time October of 1643 came around, the two kingdoms of Charles I had been embroiled in a bitter civil war for well over a year. The grave consequences of this violence slowly began to reveal themselves as the months went on, as atrocities against one's fellow countrymen became even more common on both sides, while the gentlemanly warfare of the early war faded away. As the Earl of Essex and his royalist enemies were locked in the bloody First Battle of Newbury,
which so far the royalists have been on the front foot so far.
Political dealings between Parliament and the Scottish Covenanter government were reaching a conclusion which would intensify the war to an even greater degree. The parliamentarians needed a strong military ally to win the war, and the Covenanters possessed an army ready to march. In return for a promise to implement the Presbyterian religious system in England, Scotland would help to crush Charles's royalists. After months of back-and-forth negotiation, the so-called Solemn League and Covenant was finalised on September 25, 1643. Meanwhile, the king was bolstering his forces for the next confrontation, as royalist soldiers, previously tied down in Ireland, began returning home. As 1644 began, the north of England came under decisive royalist control by the efforts of William Cavendish, Earl of Newcastle. This all changed on January 16th, when the Covenanter army, made up of 18,000 foot, 3,000 cavalry, 600 dragoons.
When I got told about the English Civil War years ago, I did not know that armies of Scotland would actually get involved. So this has blown my mind a little bit.
Dragoons and 120 cannons crossed the River Tweed and invaded English territory, entering the war on Parliament's side. It was led by the illustrious veteran of Lutzen, Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven. Leven's advance towards Newcastle was almost unopposed, but Cavendish quickly received word of the invasion and managed to lead the Scots to the city, mainly.
So far, from what I've seen, the best two commanders for the Royalists have been Prince Rupert and the Earl of Newcastle.
Because Leven had to wait for his heavy cannons to arrive by ship. When he finally arrived before the city walls on February 3rd, He found many of the suburbs burned to the ground by Cavendish's defending force, who were now reinforced by 5,000 men. Nevertheless, the Tyneside city was put under siege. However, constant harassment of Scottish supply lines by veteran Royalist cavalry and lack of shelter, provoked by the defenders' scorched earth tactics, forced Leven to depart with most of his army on the 22nd. Only 6 regiments of the Covenanter army remained to continue the siege. Unwilling to let his enemy escape unhindered, Cavendish set out in pursuit with most of his own troops. Over the next few weeks, Leven and Cavendish maneuvered around one another, unwilling to engage because of the unfavorable terrain and bad weather. Finally, in late March, Leven engaged and defeated his foe in a close battle near Sunderland, forcing him to flee in the direction of York. By this loss, the northern forces of the king needed help immediately, and their main hope for such assistance rested with Prince Rupert, who set off towards Yorkshire to relieve Cavendish's battered host. In a brilliantly executed campaign, Rupert's meagre army broke a siege at the strategically crucial Royalist stronghold of Newark on March 22nd, with the prince almost losing his life in the attempt. Instead of continuing his march, the dashing cavalier withdrew to his base at Shrewsbury to raise more men, but barely had time to relax before terrible news came from the south. A week after Rupert's triumph in Nottinghamshire, William Waller got his revenge for Roundway Down by defeating Hopton's Royalist army at the Battle of Cheriton, a defeat which ended any prospect of Royalist victory in the south. Royalist fortunes had even begun to sour in Yorkshire, when on April 12th, an army of Sir Thomas Fairfax defeated John Bellacy at the town of Selby, and routed a significant portion of York's intended garrison. After receiving word of the unfolding disaster, the Earl of Newcastle force-marched his army for the second time in just under a year, hoping to reinforce York's defences before the parliamentarians could get there. Once again he succeeded, despite losing many stragglers and deserters along the way, reaching the northern Royalist bastion on April 15th. 3 days later, the Covenanter army closed in on Wetherby and rendezvoused with the parliamentary army of Sir Thomas Fairfax, fresh from its victory at Selby. Together, starting on the 22nd, the Allies put England's great northern city to siege. Charles I knew that if York fell, the north would fall. To deal with the sudden strategic crisis that the war effort now faced, leading Royalist commanders assembled at Oxford on April 25th for a council of war. After vigorous
I suppose, because as you can see, this line of parliamentarian territory, if York did fall, they'll be stuck between the parliamentarians and the Scottish. So I suppose that does make sense.
Debate, Prince Rupert gained the upper hand. It was decided that the remnant of Hopton's defeated army would be absorbed into Charles's central army at Oxford, and this newly bolstered force would stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, Rupert himself would raise several thousand troops and go north to relieve York. With that decided, Rupert arrived back in Shrewsbury on May 6th to begin mustering his own men. On that same day, on the other side of England, the Eastern Association Army under Manchester and Cromwell took Lincoln, freeing them up to start marching to Yorkshire as well. Rupert's march began later in the month, with an attempt to assert Royalist authority in Lancashire. He first bypassed the firmly parliamentarian town of Manchester, but subsequently seized and ravaged nearby Bolton. After fighting for the town came to an end, no mercy was given, and up to 1,000 soldiers and civilians were slaughtered. This massacre helped bolster parliamentarian propaganda. After all, if the king was relying on such butchery of English people to win this war, was he truly their king? In Bolton, Rupert received a welcome surprise when 5,000 Royalist cavalry joined his army from the northeast. These were the Earl of Newcastle's horsemen, who had been prudently sent away before the siege began, as cavalry would be useless in such a situation. As Rupert secured Liverpool and cemented Royalist control of Lancashire, the king disregarded the southern defensive strategy and embarked on a military campaign in the region. It was a disaster, leading to the breach of Oxford's defensive ring of garrisons and forcing Charles to flee to Worcester, with Essex and Waller hot on his heels. At this point, the king, realizing Prince Rupert's advice to only consolidate and defend in the south should not have been ignored, sent a set of ambiguous orders, which essentially left Rupert to make his own mind up. We'll catch up with this theatre in our next episode. Upon receiving the communiqué, the Cavalier General interpreted the unclear command in his own way. He would relieve York, as well as destroy the parliamentarians and their Scottish allies, before victoriously marching south to save the king. After the campaign that was about to happen, he would carry that letter from the king for the rest of his life. Rupert's relief army, now about 14,000 strong, set off to relieve York. News that the prince's army was only a day away caused the allies to hastily lift their siege. They withdrew to proactively meet the royalist army, moving their large combined force onto a ridge near a village 5 miles southwest of York, known as Long Marston. The Knaresborough Road, which Rupert was using to march his army, crossed immediately in front of this ridge, with the River Nid behind it. This rendered the direct route to York almost impossible to navigate for the royalists without having a dangerous enemy army threatening their flank. Rather than risk such an attack, the wily prince resorted to deception. Just before dawn on July 1st, royalist horsemen were spotted advancing up the Knaresborough Road. To the parliamentarians and Scots, it was apparent that this force of cavalry were Rupert's vanguard, with the obvious implication that his main army was only a short while away. Accordingly, they drew up their men in battle formation and waited for the bulk of Rupert's army to arrive. However, the royalist vanguard was just an illusion, luring Leven, Fairfax and the others into a false sense of security. While it did everything that a normal vanguard was expected to do, Charles's illustrious nephew swung the majority of his army north at Knaresborough town, crossed the Ouse at Boroughbridge, and was encamped in Gultree's forest by nightfall. Then his forces advanced even further, scattering a small detachment of enemy dragoons at Nether Poppleton and securing a boat bridge there. Realizing they had been outwitted, and fearing Rupert would be able to cut their supply lines to the south if he gave them the slip again, most of Parliament's combined army began marching south to Tadcaster, while its cavalry remained at Marston Moor, covering the retreat. At about the same time, the Royalist cavalry, which had previously been ordered to leave the city by Newcastle, strode back into York under Lord George Goring and formally relieved the city. In a brilliant manoeuvre, which was arguably one of his greatest in the entire Civil War, Rupert had saved old Roman Eboracum without firing a shot. Obeying what he thought to be the king's command to relieve York, then defeat Parliament's army, and then come south urgently, Prince Rupert almost immediately gathered his own and Newcastle's men. Bolstered by the reluctant York garrison and their even more reluctant commanders, the prince marched to Marston Moor and visibly challenged the enemy to a pitched battle. By early evening on July 2nd, 1644, two of the Civil War's largest armies so far were lining up against one another across Marston Moor. The battlefield was bounded in the east by Long Marston village, and in the west by Tockwith. The 28,000-strong parliamentarian army took position on a high ridge, while Rupert's significantly outnumbered 18,000 royalists were forced to occupy a lower section of the moorland to the north. Their position was fronted by an irregular irrigation ditch, which would function as a useful defensive equalizer. On each of the Roundhead flanks, 3,000 English parliamentarian cavalry and 1,000 Scottish troopers were arrayed in 3 lines of battle, supported by interspersed musketeers on foot. The right wing, closer to Long Marston, was led by Sir Thomas Fairfax, while the left was under the command of Oliver Cromwell, accompanied by his increasingly lethal unit of mounted troops, the Ironsides. Forming the mass of Parliament's army were 20,000 infantry in the centre of the battle line. In the vanguard were units from Lord Ferdinando Fairfax's army of Yorkshiremen in the centre, Eastern Association army troops of Manchester's on the left, and a brigade of Scots on the right. Behind them in the second line were more of Manchester's infantry and Leven's Scots, and even more Covenanters were in reserve. The supreme command of the entire army of both kingdoms lay with the Earl of Leven. Down the slope, Prince Rupert's feared royalist cavalry matched their opposite numbers man for man and horse for horse, possessing about 4,000 on both the left and right, under Lords John Byron and George Goring respectively. Each of these divisions were also accompanied by musketeer units. However, the Cavalier army only had 10 to 11,000 foot in the centre. It was drawn up in the Swedish style that Rupert had witnessed firsthand during his service on the continent, and was led by the Earl of Newcastle, Prince Rupert himself, and a number of brigade commanders. After a wait of several hours, the battle finally began at about 7:30 p.m. with an artillery duel on the western side of the field. Parliamentarian guns began blasting Byron's cavalry, causing a number of casualties and provoking a response from some royalist cannons which had been placed on an area of high ground just in front. This shelling caused some chaos in Cromwell's own ranks and the death of his own nephew. The Roundhead commander kept his cool, responding by ordering his guns to advance with two,
which I can imagine is not easy to do when you see your relative being killed in front of you,
infantry regiments as backup. Foot regiments of Prince Rupert and Lord Byron marched out to meet them, and a short firefight took place, mauling the royalist units and forcing them into retreat. This triumph heralded an all-out parliamentarian infantry running march down the ridge slope, as thunder began to crack and lightning flashed from above. In the centre, the brigades of Lord Fairfax and Crawford made good progress, managing to push over the defensive ditch and even capturing 4 royalist Drake-class cannons. However, not all was going the parliamentarians' way, for the Scottish infantry under Bailey had a more difficult time breaking through the enemy's ranks, bogged down by the cavalry action taking place next to them. On the battlefield's eastern wing, Sir Thomas Fairfax opened the fighting by charging 400 mounted vanguard under his personal command against a similarly sized unit of royalist cavalry opposite him. The result was a swift rout of the Cavalier horsemen in the direction of York, followed by Fairfax and his horse. However, this left most of the parliamentary forces without an overall commander, and they quickly became bogged down during the advance. Uneven terrain, bracken, hedges, and constant musketry volleys caused disarray among the leaderless horsemen, and at the moment they were at their most vulnerable, Lord Goring's troopers launched a thunderous charge, driving them from the field of battle. Just like at Edgehill 2 years before, most royalist horsemen broke ranks to chase their defeated enemy, cutting many fleeing soldiers down and plundering the Allies' baggage train beyond the ridge. Though they had won their engagement, Goring's cavalry had also left the battle. As the parliamentarian cavalry on the right was being run off the field by Goring, Oliver Cromwell rode out at the head of his first line of Ironsides and charged headlong at Lord Byron's royalist horse opposite, who countercharged across the moor to meet them. Both sets of horsemen fired their pistol carbines until they were exhausted, before wheeling around, unsheathing their sabres for a second charge. In this initial disorderly clash, it was Cromwell's horse who came off better, inflicting some casualties and slowly driving Byron back. The situation became even more serious when Colonel Vermuyden's second line rode forward to join their commander, and for a few moments it seemed as though the royalists might buckle. However, they didn't break under the pressure, allowing time for their own second line to join the fray and stabilize what was quickly becoming the largest cavalry engagement of the war. Somewhere in the chaotic fray, Oliver Cromwell suffered a blade slash to his neck, but carried on fighting nevertheless amidst his men. Witnessing the seemingly decisive clash which was taking place near Tockwith, Prince Rupert rallied his army's cavalry reserve, in addition to his personal lifeguard, feeding those units into the engagement as well. His hope was to tip the scales in favour of Charles's force by hitting Cromwell's unit in the front and sides. When almost all firearms had been discharged, and the cavalry battle had become a grinding contest of sword against sword, the parliamentarian reserve of 1,000 Scottish troopers under David Leslie came forward and swept into both of Rupert's exposed flanks. Attacked from the front by Cromwell and from the sides by his Scottish allies, the royalist front line was scythed apart and broken with heavy losses. Witnessing the ensuing massacre, their comrades in the rear broke and ran, with Rupert himself shamefully caught up in the rout. Unlike Goring's men on the other side of the field, Oliver Cromwell and his capable officers kept full control of their own highly disciplined mounted troops, immediately bringing the pursuit to a stop before it began. They began to regroup and take stock of the strategic situation. In the centre, Lord Fairfax's initially victorious Foot Brigade was countercharged by Newcastle. Though this wasn't in itself critical, the shock of Newcastle's push also drove the 1st and 2nd Line Scottish infantry into retreat, opening a gap in the Parliamentarian line. Led by Sir William Blakiston, another small Royalist cavalry reserve nearby took the opportunity and charged into the gulf which the Scots had left, carving through the Allies' vulnerable underbelly and even breaking through their final line. However, indiscipline once again proved fatal, and Blakiston's men too rode off the field to plunder the enemy baggage. The only section of Goring's cavalry to have remained on the field then attacked the infantry units in Parliament's right centre, causing significant damage and even frightening Leven, Lord Fairfax and Manchester into fleeing the field. The combined army's foot was now in almost total disarray. Sir Thomas Fairfax returned to the field with a few hundred horses at that moment. Riding all the way across to Cromwell's position, he supposedly asked, "Major General, what shall I do?" In response, Fairfax said, "Sir, if you charge, not all is lost." Cromwell's cavalry looped around the rear of the Royalist line, scattering Goring's hastily returned cavalry, and then turned on the Cavalier infantry. This marked the end of the battle. Hundreds of fleeing Royalists were slain, and only Newcastle's so-called lambs, elite troops clad in white woolen uniforms, refused to flee and died to a man. After a battle lasting several hours, 4,000 men of the King's army lay strewn across the bloody battlefield of Marston Moor, at the cost of only about 300 parliamentarians. After being routed by Cromwell and the Scots, Prince Rupert retreated in shame with his surviving cavalry. He would obsessively keep the King's ambiguous order on his person for the rest of his life, ready to excuse his defeat if challenged. The great Earl of Newcastle, whose talents initially secured northern England for the Royalists, could not handle the embarrassment. He abandoned Charles's cause completely, fleeing first to Scarborough and then across the sea to a self-imposed exile in Hamburg. With this disaster, the parliamentarians gained complete control of the north. Our series on the English Civil War will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would...
that'll do it. This has been another interesting video by Kings and Generals. So if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.